Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Whitmore, Russia Program Director at CEPA, and I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual conversation on society's view on the rule of law in Russia. Good morning to our friends in the United States. Good evening to our friends in Europe. This is the second part of a three-part project that CEPA is doing in conjunction with the Levada Center, looking at modernizing trends in Russian society. Can citizens develop a respect for the rule of law when they are governed by a patrimonial political system in which money, property, and power are fused, where the rule of law and property rights are weak, and where patron-client relationships trump laws and institutions? These questions are increasingly relevant as the first post-Soviet generation and its successor generations come of age in Russia. Do Russians feel protected by the rule of law? Do they view their rulers as accountable? Do they believe in values like free speech? To what extent are these attitudes driven by generational factors and by personal experience? Are these views changing? And can these attitudes spark bottom-up support for political change among Russians? These are just some of the issues we're going to explore in the next hour with the co-authors of the recently published report, Society's View on the Rule of Law in Russia, which has been published on the CEPA website this week. And with that, I will introduce our awesome panelists. Maria Snegovaya is a fellow at CEPA's Russia program. Denise Volkov is a Moscow-based sociologist and deputy director of the Levada Center, and William Pomerantz is deputy director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. So welcome to all of you. And by way of structure, I want to keep it as interactive as possible, do a couple rounds of questions for our panelists before we field questions from our virtual audience. So I'd ask all of our distinguished panelists to keep your remarks as brief as possible. And Maria, let's start it off with you. The report's findings show that the number of Russians who feel protected by the law has increased over the last 14 years, but at the same time, approximately 60% of Russians do not believe the authorities are accountable. Now, these findings appear at first glance contradictory. But those of us that study Russia for a living understand that things that look contradictory on the surface may in fact be completely logical upon closer examination. So I was wondering, Maria, if you could kind of flesh this out and just kind of talk about your top line findings a bit.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I also wanted to thank the Kennan Institute for joining us today for this panel. It's a big honor. So thank you. I think you pointed out a very important question, since we were quite puzzled, as a matter of fact, to discover are they actually overall improving attitudes of Russians towards the view of legal protections. In response, specifically, do you personally feel protected by the law? We find that the number actually of such people who respond positively has increased by 6% as opposed to 2018 and has reached 46%. As of now, the society is more or less half and half split in answers to this question. And in our report, we actually devote quite substantive part to discussing this possible explanations to this phenomenon, given the fact that, honestly, Russia's reality, based on the international ranking of rule of law or anything, frankly, we know about the situation that are there, does not really confirm this argument that the situation with rule of law is improving. So one possible explanation is actually provided by a great scholar, Catherine Handley, whom we quote a lot in our overview of the Russian situation. She is a scholar of the legal situation in Russia, and her proposed explanation is the so-called duality of law in Russia, meaning that on the regular day-to-day basis, essentially when, I don't know, so you got robbed in the streets, essentially. Russians can contact the police and courts and get relatively satisfactory results in response. This is where the issue does not concern really the politically charged cases where the authorities interfere and where the law becomes completely biased. This argument partly is what explains this apparent contradiction with, as you asked, that there's an increasing number of people who at the same time feel protected by the law, but also don't think the authorities are accountable. It's possible a lot of these people just don't interact face-to-face with the instances, don't face those instances when the law gets essentially manipulated by the authorities. However, it's important to keep in mind that the Russian legal system is also very corrupt. So even on your day-to-day regular basis, even when faced with robbery, it's not a given that you will receive the results that are satisfactory. As a matter of fact, as we show, people who actually get to contact Russia's legal institutions, they actually feel more dissatisfied and feel less protected by the law than people who do not contact the legal institutions in Russia. So another possible explanation, which I honestly find more plausible, is a possibility that the formulation of the story question, do you personally feel protected by the law, is really way too abstract. And people somewhat respond what they think is expected of them in answering this question, sort of like, is it good to live in Russia? Yes, it's good to live in Russia. And this might be actually the case where the worse the situation is, the more people are likely to sort of respond this way in order to signal their loyalty to the system, and especially if they don't feel overall secure about the situation. But when we ask them more specific question, like, for example, do you believe that you and your close one could suffer from arbitrary law enforcement? This is where we find the answers that are much closer to the reality that we also see from the media or from the Russia's ratings on the rule of law. Here we find that at least 51% argue that it could happen, so they or their relatives can suffer from the arbitrary law enforcement, and 15% actually report that it has already happened to them. So about 2/3 of the society actually are quite unhappy with the legal protections in Russia, and that, I would argue, is a much more the really objective reflection of the real situation in Russia.
Thank you, Maria. I want to stick with you for a minute because as you were talking, I couldn't help but recall an incident when I was living in Petersburg in the late 90s, and some Russian friends and I had gone out to dinner, and we decided to go for a walk. It was white nights, it was summer, and we were deciding, hey, do you guys want to walk down Nevsky or Nevsky Prospect, or do you want to like turn down the Fontanka embankment? And one of my Russian friends said, let's turn down the Fontanka embankment because Nevsky's not safe. There are too many police there. And every one of us reacted like, oh yeah, you're right. Nevsky isn't safe. There's far too many police there. And this idea that it was dangerous to go someplace where the police were spoke to this expectation that you could be subject to kind of arbitrary treatment by law enforcement at the time. And this was not an unreasonable fear. Police were known for doing document checks and using those document checks to shake you down and rob you. This happened kind of regularly. In my days as a journalist, I covered a lot of this. What I'm hearing from you is that there is an increased, like, less of a suspicion that that kind of thing is going to happen, or am I understanding you correctly? But in reality, it's not changing. How do you see attitudes changing and the reality changing on this? Because I don't think it's as bad as it was in the late 90s, although we're also, you know, Russia's not become Canada either. So I was kind of wondering if you could kind of put that into perspective over like longitudinal change on.
As a matter of fact, we do report the data on the confidence in the law enforcement agencies, specifically to answer your questions, Brian. And they also show a dynamic that's very similar to the dynamic of answers to the question, do you personally feel protected by the law? That is, the number of people who actually feel more confident in the law enforcement agencies in Russia also has been growing consistently over the last year, starting about, let's say, 2005. In the recent years, however, especially after the retirement age increase, there's this there's some decline in this confidence. And that's interesting, once again, just an indication that we are here really measuring less the real confidence in the law enforcement agencies as the overall sort of satisfaction with the quality of life in the country. Because how else do you explain the fact that, for example, the Crimea annexation and the boost, you know, and patriotism that it provided actually really boosted all the the ratings of the approval of the authorities, as well as like this confidence in the rule of law and law enforcement agencies. And by contrast, the unpopular retirement age increase introduced by the authorities in mid-2018 actually had the opposite effect. All of the ratings of the authorities and the confidence in law enforcement agencies has collapsed. So in this sense, it's important dealing with sociology in Russia to keep in mind that we really only get so much from respondents by asking these questions that are relatively abstract. But when we get more specific, as I mentioned before, we actually see that the awareness about the arbitrariness of the law enforcement is still high in the society. And of course, that's also reinforced by overall perception, growing perception that the authorities are not accountable to the society. Our most interesting finding, I would argue, in this report is the opposite relationship between the experience of violation of rights and contacting the legal law enforcement agencies and feeling protected by the law. So most of these surveys, they look at the broader picture of overall, essentially, societal thermometer, so to speak. But once we get more in depth, people who actually have first-hand experience interacting with Russia's legal enforcement agencies tend to significantly decline the assessment of the rule of law protection in Russia. And this is actually regardless of what kind of institution they contacted. And generally says that if anything, the legal enforcement agencies in Russia do not perform their function well, because they're not able to restore the sense of confidence in the in justice in life, so to speak, or in people who actually suffer from the rights violations.
So that holds across generations. I mean, you have a situation where if you had experience with law enforcement, your trust in law enforcement goes down, and this holds across generations.
I think it is. I think Denis will help me here. Actually, I think yeah, it does hold. Unfortunately, once you start disaggregating our respondents, our sample by different types of law enforcement agencies that they contacted, we actually have a small sample. But overall, that's true. Yeah, and interestingly enough, the assessment of respondents declines not only when it comes to law enforcement agencies per se, but also their overall trust in the system, their approval of Putin also seems to decline, and it's potentially a really serious challenge to the authorities now that, for example, in the situation of the pandemic, it's possible that the Russians will experience the violations of their rights, such as right, for example, to medical assistance more frequently.
That's an interesting finding, and at the same time, it's not a very encouraging finding. I want to move to you, Denise. There's something else that jumped out at me in the report, and that's that you point out correctly that Russians are generally more concerned with rights associated with their material well-being, what is kind of referred to as social rights in the Russian lexicon, things like healthcare, social welfare. They're more concerned with these things than with political rights like free speech. But at the same time, your results show that Russians increasingly care more and more about free speech. And I was wondering what independent variables you attributed to this. Is this a generational phenomenon, or is it associated with socioeconomic status, attitude towards the regime? What were your findings there?
Thank you, Brian. Hello to everyone. Nice to be with you today. First of all, I would like to say that not everyone in Russia, all our respondents can see the violation of their rights. I mean, if we speaking about social political rights, and we see that our respondents tend to split into two groups: those who are not well off, those who are elderly people living outside big cities. They speak first of all about these social rights, social economic problems, and of course it's the most obvious problems and which these people experience. And it is very easy to feel that these rights are violated. But at the same time, there is the second group, to whom well, so-called social political rights are more important, and these are, of course, people who have already solved the economic problems. But we see that, for example, speaking of free speech, it is the youngest age group who is speaking about importance of this right, about the violation of this right, and it's coincide, of course, with the usage of the internet. And because the youngest generation, like anywhere else, is the most active user of the internet, and they know how to use it, and they see, observe, and experience the blockages. They see that you can post something on the social networks and then be persecuted, and that's what we see not only in our data, and we see it in focus groups as well. It's youngest generation who is speaking about it. But it's not only about the free speech, it's also about the necessity of fair trial and the violation of the fair trial, which people are speaking about. And it is, I think, one of the major social political right, I would say, that both well-off citizens in the biggest cities are speaking about, and actually the people who are not so well-off, because we see in other surveys that in any case, the courts are more resultative way of solving your problems than, for example, the police. And it's not only the highly educated people who are using it, but also the people who have, I mean, economic problems and so on. So it's becoming a tool, and when people could not always can find justice in the court, this is the important issue that both of these groups are talking about. So that's how I see our data.
Well, thank you, Dennis. That's interesting. And what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is you're saying that age is a larger determinant than socioeconomic status, is what I seem to be hearing, and that this holds across socioeconomic status. So all young people, whether they're rich or poor, are more concerned with free speech. Is that an accurate assessment of your findings?
Not all, of course,
but in general, I mean,
yeah, and it's with the courts, for example, it is not again the youngest group who is speaking about it, because the youngest generation is not yet using the courts as a tool. It's more about the middle-aged groups, about the active groups like entrepreneurs, like with high status, but also the most vulnerable groups who do not have work, who can use it to fight for their social economic rights. So it's not absolutely straightforward and unevenly divided.
And what about older respondents? Do those that are better off, so richer older people, do they care more about political rights, or are they like people in their age cohort who are less well off? Do they care more about economic rights? I'm just trying to get a sense of which of these variables has more explanatory power, if that's possible.
Well, actually, we did not look at this specifically, but I can guess that people who have already solved the economic problems and who are better educated, so can understand that their rights are being violated. Because even when we ask about going to the police, going to courts, not every one of these are fighting for their rights. They don't understand it in this way. Part of these people are going there for help. And not everybody is thinking on this in these terms, but I think very increasingly, but very not quickly. I mean, it's the process are going this way, that more information is spreading. Internet became very important in this, in spreading this information. And I think it's again with the in other projects, when we talk with human rights activists, they always talk about, well, number of violations, big problems. But when we ask them to compare the situation with the early years of this modern Russian state, then they say, well, of course, we have done great job. People have much more experience now, and there are some social networks of support that help people to find the solution when the problem arises. So some changes going on, even within the Putin.
So we basically have these two variables are primary drivers, but we probably would need a little more research to understand which ones has more explanatory power. It'd be really interesting to see some crosstabs on that at some point. I want to remind our audience that you can ask questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, or if you're following this on Twitter, you can ask your questions in Twitter. We're getting some questions coming in, but before we go to questions, I want to bring Will into the discussion. Will, I wanted to get basically your top line reaction to the report. What jumped out at you? I know you had some thoughts on it, and maybe you'd want to follow up with Maria and Denise about some of your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and we're so pleased to be co-hosting this event with CEPA. Indeed, I think these findings are rather consistent with the development of Russian law, not just for decades, but maybe even for centuries. Because in the history of Russian law, it has been very difficult to hold the leader, whether it's the Tsar, the General Secretary, or the President, accountable to the law. Indeed, what is interesting about this report is that it shows that the Yeltsin reforms, which people dismiss as a time of disorder and chaos, have actually been much more resilient than is originally perceived. Because all these institutions of law, whether it be a more independent courts, whether it be a more adversarial system, these all trace to the Yeltsin reforms. And despite Putin's efforts, he has not been able to kind of displace them. And they have continued to influence the development of legal thought. Another point that I'm reminded of is everyone uses this terminology, rule of law, although, as Maria knows, Catherine Henley really doesn't like this term. And I think that a better understanding of how Russians perceive law is not to use this notion of rule of law, which is very Western and implies certain basic principles such as human rights and separation of powers. I think what we have is a continuation of the understanding of legality, zakonos in Russian law. And that is not as far reaching as the term rule of law. And therefore, what Russian law consistently stresses is not the emphasis on rights, whether economic or political, but a notion of abiding by the law, of law observance or law abidingness. And I think that is the crux of what the survey is finding, that there is still an emphasis on notions of legality and not a notion of rights. That being said, you can see from the survey that the notion of rights has expanded to emphasize certain civil rights. But social rights were always what was emphasized in the Soviet period. And if you want to bring the debate up to the present day, Putin has doubled down essentially on social rights with his constitutional reforms, because these reforms both call for increases of pensions and other social rights are emphasized, where he doesn't really discuss in these amendments the civil rights that are embodied in the Constitution. Indeed, he emphasizes the notion of social rights at the expense of the individual freedoms that are articulated in Article 2 of the Russian Constitution. So I think this report is consistent with a long-term understanding of Russian law. And in many ways, Putin's amendments take into account the long-term biases within Russian law, since he has bet that the state, and he has strengthened the state, instead of focusing on civil liberties.
Yeah, Will, it does point to, like, I mean, the fundamental difference between governance in Russia and governance in the West, and is in the West, it's based on institutions, and in Russia, it's largely based on personalized rule. And one has to wonder if this stress on so-called social rights at the expense of individual rights is kind of the logical extension of that system. That seemed to be what you were driving at. And maybe I mean, it'd be interesting to be able to measure Russians' trust in institutions. I mean, this is effectively what we're doing under a different name. But I was wondering if you could, if that was really where you were driving at. We're looking at two different notions of law and rule, governance.
We're looking at two different notions of law, of what is emphasized. I often go back to the 1906 fundamental laws. The first thing that the Tsar estate emphasized when it wrote a constitution, that the Russian state was one and indivisible. It didn't lead with questions of orthodoxy. It didn't lead with questions of right. It led with the notion of the state and state unity. That is the highest value. And if you look at all the other constitutions, whether the Soviet and now post-Soviet, they also stress the notion of unity as opposed to the assertion of rights. And indeed, in the amendments that Putin just proposed, one of his amendments stresses the notion of state unity, which is part of the 1,000-year history of the Russian Federation. So again, if what we're looking at is a different system and different institutions. Again, I don't want to go into a long description of the institutions, but what I argue in other places is that the most important institution in Russian history is the procracy, the prosecutor's office, not an independent judiciary, not an independent bar association. The procracy has a 300-year history, or will be celebrating its 300th anniversary in 2022. And they have emphasized the notion of supervision and their powers. And their powers are much broader, and much more difficult to restrain than the power of a prosecutor's office in other countries.
And the prosecutor's office is effectively an extension of the executive branch, which is significant. And it's kind of seen that that's where it belongs. I mean, it's again this. Go ahead.
Yes. So again, it's very interesting. The 1993 original Constitution stuck the procracy under judicial power, even though it doesn't have any relationship to judicial power. The amendments in 2014 talked about judicial power and the procracy, so they at least got a mention in the Constitution as a chapter heading. And now we have the 2020 amendments that have brought the rights of supervision, which were introduced through legislation in 1995. They now have become a constitutional principle, and the procracy's rights to supervise legality in the Russian Federation.
And I want to actually, Will, you got me thinking because, and I want to go back to both Maria and Denise, because you kind of inspired a question here. I mean, if you go back, Russia has, going back to the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, I mean, Ed Kennan writes about this in his classic monograph, The Muscovite Political Folkways, about how this recreation of the forms of Western style governance, whatever that may be at any point in history, without the content of that. And I'm wondering, to Maria and to Denise, if when we talk about rights and when we talk about law, and when you ask that question, or when the Levada Center asks that question to Russian respondent X, Y, or Z, are they understanding this concept in the same way that we are understanding this concept? And I'm saying maybe this is difficult to quantify, and it gets into where you almost have to get into kind of an interpretive understanding of this, and maybe a quantitative study is hard to get at that. I'm just wondering, just briefly, if Maria and Denise, you could weigh in on that, because Will got me thinking about this.
It's an important point. Thank you, Will. And by the way, we cite Will's recent book in quite a lot of detail. I appreciate for quite nice outline of the legal developments in Russia, starting with Yeltsin that the book provides. Now, of course, so first of all, that's the first question, frankly, that emerges when you start studying the topic of the rule of law in Russia. And of course, we've been even joking about how do you study something that does not exist. But if you look at our questions and Levada Center's question, and really an agency with several decades of experience of polls in Russia, they're relatively careful not to, ask questions that create this questionable dichotomy, whether the people will understand what we're really asking them about. Except for the first question, do you personally feel protected by the law, that you can argue is relatively abstract. The remaining questions are actually quite specific. They ask particular questions about attitudes towards the work of the law enforcement agencies, protection of the institutions, the type of institutions, the people contacted, the legal institutions, etc., etc. So we are, I think, pretty nicely able to avoid this conundrum of how Russians understand the rule of law. And there is zero, honestly, doubt that Russians don't really understand what rule of law is. So at least in our report, we actually start by defining it as the notion that the state authorities exercise the power within a framework of established norms rather than an arbitrary or discretionary manner. And as Will correctly points out, in Russia, since the understanding of law abidingness is relatively legalist, is based on abiding law by the letter rather than by the spirit, it's a concept that's really hard to explain to the people, especially to those who have never lived outside of the country and don't have such an experience. But it's still, at the same time, I would not overcomplicate this problem because it's still relatively understandable to most people what we're talking here about. We are talking about the police, of the courts system, free from corruption. We're talking about a person's ability to at least somewhat get certain kind of justice when he or she faces certain violations of the rights. So that person, at least under the existing, letter of the law, given that the spirit really does not exist in Russia. So the problem is there, but I think we have been able to get around it relatively nicely.
Denise, you ask these questions of Russians for a living to come up with these very informative and helpful results that we all devour every time Levada puts out a report. Do you agree with Maria, or do you run into these problems of interpretation and understanding of what concepts like law and rights mean to a respondent and how it may be different than what it means to you or to us?
Yes, of course, and exactly as Maria said, we tried to ask exact questions, and so we are talking about the rule of law in the beginning, maybe in the head of this report that we published in Russia. But again, it's for us to define. We didn't ask people to define this abstract word and concept. So so we try to ask specific questions, but in focus groups, we of course sometimes discuss it. And the problem here, I think, that not that people don't understand something. Many people do understand, and they have this feeling that they have certain rights, and they have certain rights under Russian Constitution. And many people that we see in the streets who try to campaign for justice, they usually appeal to the Constitution. But what we see in focus groups that people not always believe that Constitution guarantees all these rights that are stated there. So in this sense, sometimes people just smile at me when I'm conducting a focus group, and I'm saying, well, we have rights, of course. I mean, under constitutional, and they smile. Of course we have. Of course we have all these rights. They're on paper and so on, but they not always are not always observed, and this is the problem. And again, it's more about with highly educated people in the biggest cities who start to campaigning for these rights. But again, it's not only they who understand when justice is being done. So it's in these terms, simple terms, I think people in Russia and in other places more or less understand it in the same way when they feel injustice.
No, this all reminds me of a debate that was going on in what used to be called Soviet studies back when I was in graduate school in the Reagan administration about whether the Soviet Union was sui generis, whether there was a unique kind of polity, or could we study it the way we studied Western society? And I think it's fascinating that, all these years after, all these decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we still seem to be having this sui generis debate. Will, I wanted to give you one more chance if you wanted to jump in and respond to Maria and Dennis before we went to audience questions.
Just a brief remark, and I think what I just want to kind of look at the language question, because there's obviously this distinction between prava and zakon, which both mean law, but in fact, prava means a more general understanding and philosophical understanding, and zakon focuses on statutes. So when you talk about law to begin with, in the Russian language, it's not one word, but two words. Now that's true in other countries as well, not necessarily the United States, but it's true in other countries, in German and in French and so forth. So that you have these multiple understandings of law, even in the vocabulary. And the second question that I wanted to talk about is the Constitution and rights. Again, I'll bring not to go backwards, but I'll bring this up to the current day. One of the important aspects of the Putin amendments is that he followed the letter but not the spirit of the law. Now, according to the Russian Constitution, the first two chapters of the highest law cannot be amended other than by constitutional assembly. Putin clearly didn't want to call a constitutional assembly, and he did not. So therefore, in order to have an end around against this constitutional prohibition that protects these first two chapters, he simply put all his reforms in chapters 3 through 8, thereby undermining all the protections that were in the first two chapters and not really obeying the spirit of the law, which really held these first two chapters on the fundamentals of the Russian system and the individual freedoms and rights as sacrosanct. So again, what we have is, as was discussed by the other two panelists, the law as written and the law in action. And what Putin has done is find a way to undermine the first two chapters while obeying the letter of the law.
Thank you, Will. That's a very good point. And the difference between zakon, the more formalistic understanding of the law, and pravo, the spirit of the law, if you will, is an important distinction. And I would imagine that language matters when you're asking a survey question, right? And which of those you use. I want to go to questions now. We got some questions from the audience. First one's from Peter Borisov. Can you address the difference in how human rights laws are applied to ethnic Russians compared to ethnic minorities, such as Ukrainians, Tatars, and others in the Russian Federation? Are ethnic Russians comfortable with these reported double standards? That's something we haven't really looked into. I don't know how much the study looked into this, but how much of ethnicity is a factor here. This seems to be a recurring theme in a lot of the questions we're getting. So just fair warning to Denise and Maria about that. I don't know which of you want to jump in on this. I see Maria's nodding. That's an indication you want to say something.
Yeah, I saw this question, so I had time a little bit to prepare. Just a warning for our audience, right? That our questions concern broader understanding the legal protections in Russia of the larger population overall, rather than specific ethnic subgroups that are also a minority in Russia. But to answer your question, I would encourage you to look at the Kirill Rogov's paper, The Art of Coercion, Repressions and Repressiveness in Putin's Russia, where he very nicely actually outlines, outlines the dynamic of repressions in Russia. Kirill Rogov was a brilliant Russian political analyst, where he actually points out that the repressions are intensifying not against specific particular ethnic community per se, but rather something that the Russian legal agencies or regulating bodies understand, that these terrorist, quote unquote, Islamic organizations that are considered extremists by authorities. And here, of course, you can also include some organizations among Crimea Tatars, for example, where I suspect the questions are really hinting at. And so, as a matter of fact, yes, if you include this, once again, quote unquote, terrorist organizations as defined by the Russian authorities into the analysis, then yes, the attacks, the prosecution against them has been on the rise from the side, on the part of the Russian authorities in the recent years, as well as, by the way, the prosecution also of the Russian elites, a very different minority group in Russia. So that's something definitely interesting, or has to do more with the overall repression, rise and growth of the repression apparatus in Russia. And I would really encourage you to read this paper.
I mean, one part of the question that I found, are Russians comfortable with this? I mean, I think there is an understanding that the law is applied unequally based on ethnicity. And that, I mean, I remember my days in Russia. I mean, anybody that had a dark complexion of any, for any of any ethnicity was much more likely to get stopped on the street for a document check. It wasn't just Chechens. It wasn't just people from the Caucasus. It could be anybody who had a darker than usual complexion. And I was wondering, is there data out there? I know this wasn't the subject of your report, but I mean, the questioner, Peter Borisov, asked an interesting question. To what extent are Russians comfortable with this? Because this does point to where a society is going in terms of this. I don't know, Dennis, if you wanted to jump in, or Maria.
Yeah, okay, maybe it's not entirely the answer to the question, but what we find in our work, in our surveys, that it all depends on the personal experience of an individual. If he or she experienced the injustice, then he's aware of it, he thinks about it, and it changes the perception of the individual towards the state, towards the system, towards the, the worldview in general. But if the person is not been touched by the problem, we see very little solidarity in the society, and the attitude, it's not my problem, it's not my business, and quite always that the problem does not exist at all. We just don't want to see, listen, and so on. We see that, well, I think it's a problem. And to answer this question, I think that, well, people just not keen on finding out the problems of other groups, of people that are different from me, from a person. So I think it's not exactly the answer, but still.
I mean, there's a similar question, and Will, please feel free to jump in as you wish. There's a similar question along these lines, and actually, if this is interesting, is there a difference in confidence in the rule of law depending on one's ethnicity? In other words, are Russians more confident in the rule of law than Tatars or Ukrainians or Chechens or English or what have you, whatever ethnic group you want? Is ethnicity a variable in the degree to which a Russian citizen trusts the rule of law?
Well, actually, in this project, we were not looking into this aspect, and if I remember correctly, we do not have this variable in the questionnaire to answer this question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Will. I'm sorry.
Trying to, here we go. I don't, obviously this is an important question to ask in the next survey, because how people react to the law based on ethnicity is important. As we just learned yesterday in the United States and in the city of Minneapolis, ethnicity is still a very important issue in how one perceives law and legal institutions. What is interesting for Russia is that that Russia never felt for the Tsarist period. It's important to note that legal pluralism was an important feature of Russian law, and pluralism meant that certain regions were incorporated into the Russian Federation, into the Russian Empire, but also were allowed to maintain their own legal systems. So Poland maintained their legal system until it was ended. Finland did, the Baltic states did, other regions also maintained at least a customary law tradition. So there was a multiplicity of law in the Tsarist Empire. The Soviets tried to centralize it, and I think Putin has followed that trend, that he wants to try to centralize the law. But the flexibility of this pluralistic system still remains. And it remains because to govern a continent-sized empire with multiple ethnicities requires you to have flexibility. And this flexibility is still seen in places like Chechnya, where Russian law, for the most part, doesn't really reach. There's also a question of other regions where Sharia law has been reintroduced informally into the court system. So the question about ethnicity and how Russia interprets law is a very important issue, because Russia doesn't necessarily, to govern the Russian Empire and to govern the Russian Federation today, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have one law apply to the entire country. And that is a historical phenomenon. It manifests itself directly in the 1990s, and it's still an issue today.
Thank you, Will. And that excellent question came from Hannah Wilson. A related question, and you raised it, Will, is the issue of regionalism, not so much ethnicity, but is there a difference between provinces, regions of Russia, in how people view the rule of law? Is trust for the rule of law higher in metropolitan centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg, or is it higher elsewhere in the Russian Federation? I don't know to what extent your data was broken down by regions of Russia, but I was wondering if Maria and Denise could shed a little bit of light on that question.
Well, I'll just start, and I'm sure that Dennis will add. We always consistently, mostly, first of all, look at the difference between Moscow and the rest of Russia. And here, of course, we find that when it comes to being aware of the dynamics with the reality, with the rights protections on the ground, that Muscovites are much more aware of the multiple violations and overall are reveal much more sort of modernized perspective on the law. It's particularly among the citizens of big cities, this demand, the growing demand for the civil rights is much more pronounced along the lines that we have discussed before. Another point to keep in mind, it's Moscow specifically, where, for example, last year in the summer, we observed the largest protests because in the eyes of the Muscovites, the authorities have violated of the law when they did not allow the opposition candidates to run in the elections. So in this sense, the overall awareness of the situation is high among the big city residents, and hence, as a result, we see that they're much more aware of their rights violations, and hence, overall more skeptical about the situation in Russia.
So it's more of an urban-rural divide than a divide among regions of Russia.
That's my reading of the data, but let's see, maybe Denis has a little bit more nuanced understanding.
Any thoughts on this, Denis?
Oh, it's according to what Marie have said, that Muscovites are more skeptical about what's going on, but at the same time, they feel a little bit more protected by the law. So again, it's that they're a little bit more comfortable, and they understand that the Moscow is in a very privileged position in the country. But at the same time, the Muscovites are more modernized, more educated, and what is more important, the access to free media, where all these issues are much more frequently discussed. The Muscovites tend to see more injustice and have more ability to see and see on this in this angle of rights violation. So, but of course, I think it will be interesting to look at the certain regions. First of all, on national republics of Russia, but here we should have a special surveys, special investigation in these issues, again, because it's we have to make surveys on these territories and have representative data on these territories to be certain about this.
Yeah, no, we're getting great ideas for future reports, and thanks to Danny Kennan for that excellent question. I want to go now to a question from our very own Eleanor Anderson at CEPA, and this kind of goes to Maria. The last time we did an event about energy prices and politics. It's actually a pretty interesting question. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union scaled back their aggressive authoritarian policies in response to low oil prices. Do you think this pattern will repeat itself now, and will it have any impact on the rule of law in Russia? This is an interesting question because it extrapolates, Maria, on earlier research, different research you have done about the relationship between the oil price and Russian foreign policy rhetoric and behavior. Now, what Eleanor's question is driving at, and I think she's onto something here, is that the low oil price also has a domestic political component. The regime gets less strong and less confident when oil prices go down. I was wondering do you see this pattern extending that we've observed in foreign policy behavior? Do we see this pattern extending to domestic politics?
That's an interesting question. Thank you, Eleanor. So what the authorities, when the autocratic regimes, when they run out of money to co-opt the population to purchase essentially popular support, they have two alternative options, right? They have a possible option to repress more, in which case to ensure loyalty. In this case, the impact on essentially the legal situation will be the opposite of the expected, or they eventually are forced to liberalize. In this sense, of course, liberalization implies more high accountability of the authorities and higher protection of the rule of law. So in this sense, we really don't have as many data points for looking at the history of Soviet Union and Russia. But of course, when the society grows increasingly disappointed with the authorities, that is likely to get reflected in the ratings. So what we find here is, once again, in a society where the overall the understanding, maybe the so to speak, the civic education levels are not as high. Our questions and the dynamics of the responses of these questions, as I have mentioned before, are really more reflective of the overall situation with the way things are in the country. So, for example, as I said, we see that the Crimea annexation drew the belief that the Russian authorities fulfill their responsibilities to the Russian citizens up. Technically, sort of not very related, but nonetheless, because everything, overall societal optimism grew, that also generally grew the positive responses. Similarly, right now, as we have seen support for Putin erode, we see that our respondents actually mention contacting the president in order to resolve their in order to protect their rights as a less popular option, just again because the president is becoming less popular, and hence this is reflected in different ratings. So in this sense, we are pretty much guaranteed to see, as the oil prices collapse and the overall economic situation worsens in the country, that overall ratings of the rule of law and the legal situation in the country are going to decline as well, just because really, frankly, they're more reflective of the general societal feel rather than specific dynamic. But the response of the authorities, of course, will depend. We might either see increased repressiveness of the state, as a matter of fact, the dynamic we observed in the last years, or if something really fundamental changes and there is some liberalization on the side of the regime, not a very likely scenario in the near future, but maybe in the longer term. Yeah, in that case, one of the possible responses, of course, can be a higher accountability of the authorities.
Denise, does Levada's broader data show any relationship between the oil price and political attitudes in domestic politics?
Well, it's
sorry to put you on the spot there.
Well, I saw some graphs when where Putin's rating was put against oil prices, but I think it's not exactly straightforward. But of course, when oil prices are going down, and Russia's economy is very bound to it, we see that with some lag, in few months, when the situation deteriorates, of course the ratings are going down. And well, if we can remember the Yeltsin's rating in the late 90s, when the oil prices were rather low, the rating was only several percent. But at the same time, such events like Second Chechen War, for example, or war with Russia-Georgian War, Russian-Ukrainian conflict, we see how this can boost for some time, for a year or two, in the case with Crimea's annexation, it was more than 1 year. How this geopolitical emotions can boost the support of the regime and of the ruler, but on the longer run, still economy and so oil prices are important, of course.
Will, is there anything you wanted to add here? Before I got one more question I want to get to before we wrap up, but I wanted to give you a chance to get in here if you wanted to.
No, I think the price of oil is always indicative of how much money the Russian government has to spend. And I think what we've seen, not only in this crisis, but also in the previous crises, is that Putin wants to hold on to his hard currency reserves and won't spend that money. And so whether Russia comes out of the current recession and how it comes out of the current recession is highly contingent on what resources Putin throws at the Russian state and the Russian economy during this crisis.
Yeah, no, and I see a clear, as Denise pointed out, a clear relationship between the oil price and the popularity of Russian rulers, but I still don't know if there's any relationship between the oil price and support for values of rule of law and rights and the such. I want to go to the last question. I'm going to combine two questions and condense them and give everybody a chance to very briefly make some final remarks. So it's kind of a point of pride. I want to get to every question. Stanislav Splonitz asks, is in Russia there a perception of is law viewed as an element of the rule of law and legality, or rather as just something attributable to political decision making? This gets at the kind of philosophical issue we were hitting on earlier. And related to that, from Stephanie Fail, is there an awareness in the EU on the different understandings of the concepts, such as the rule of law in Russia compared to the European Union member states? How could a better understanding help us bridge the gap? I mean, I guess what both of these questions are driving at, is there any way to bridge this understanding of what we mean by the rule of law in the West and among educated Westernized Russians, and these other understanding of the rule of law, which is a much more positivist understanding of it. The law is what the sovereign says it is. So I know that's an unfair question to leave you all with, but I wanted to get to everybody's question. And I'll just give you, and bear in mind, we're bumping up against the end. So I want to give each of you a chance to just make your last thoughts before we wrap it up. Or go ahead, Will.
Okay, so I'll take a shot at the two questions, and I'll give very brief answers, and then I look forward to the other panelists commenting. Is law a source of, is it just a source of political decision making, or is there a broader philosophical understanding of law? I think that Russian law has emanated from the bureaucracy for virtually all of Russian history, with the exceptions of the Duma period, and I would say the Yeltsin presidency. And that in the post-Yeltsin and Putin era, again, it's the presidential administration that has been the primary mover of law creation and law creating activities. So I think there is a historical continuum whereby law emanates from the bureaucracy and reflects bureaucratic concerns as opposed to emanating from the people. And can you bridge the gap between European values and Russian values? We've now had a 20-year experiment with that through the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention. And of course, Putin 2 years ago, I believe, basically said that the Russian Federation doesn't have to observe European court decisions if they violate the Russian Constitution. And that principle has now entered into the Russian Constitution via the 2020 amendments. So the dialogue between Russia and Europe is still strained.
Maria, your thoughts?
Yes, I actually concur with Will. I think it's a great answer, and thank you for a very interesting question on this point. Of course, Russians just simply don't have any other experience outside of the authorities regulating the law. And I wanted to point out, as Will already emphasized, the really important rule of having at least some other institution to which you can apply for protection of your rights. In this case, that will be definitely European Court of Human Rights that provides an alternative to Russians and actually allows to shape at least some kind of understanding of the rule of law. So in the law in spirit, rather than the law as written by the Russian authorities. The NGOs, the Russian NGOs are doing an amazing job on that. And overall, as you know, Russia is one of the leaders in the number of applications to the European Court of Human Rights. In this sense, unfortunately, just because again, Russia is in a lot of ways, very influenced by this traditionalist vision of the state institutions, and with the lack of civil society, of course, there's just no way people have any experience in these abstract notions. They don't emerge out of nowhere. They emerge from a competition between different institutions within society and the grassroots, and the church that demand the king to actually modify the law. In Russia, unfortunately, the historical lack of alternative competition to the state created the situation where, of course, the law is fundamentally perceived as being created by the state. But once again, the huge importance of the European this European Convention that's been signed is that it provides at least one alternative channel. And that's, by the way, why a lot of Russian human rights defenders actually supported, were very much against from Russia being excluded from the Council of Europe, precisely because they see how important the existence of these institutions, alternative channels to which Russian people can apply to defend their rights, is actually for development of civic consciousness in Russia.
Denise, last word to you.
Well, speaking of maybe mass attitudes towards these institutions, I think there is, of course, a divide between how the active part of society view European Court, and this is indeed a very became a very important tool to try to influence the decisions, of course, within the country. But more broadly, I would say Russians see it positively, but do not. Many do not feel it very important, and do not feel that a particular individual can go into this quote and make use of it. So for many Russians, it is a very hypothetical existence. But again, it is seen rather positive. But at the same time, I think Putin exploited the notion of this sovereignty and independence that many Russians appreciate. And when you can put Russian courts against this any courts outside of the country, many, especially who do not understand how it works and so on, they support this notion that Russia should be sovereign of any other influence. But at the same time, as I said, when the problem arises, then the whole picture changes, and then many Russians are eager to exploit every opportunity in the ability to protect their rights. And then in this situation, all these international institutions suddenly became useful. So it's not necessarily always only one attitude towards them. It depends on whether people are all right or they have problems and they have to think how to deal with it.
Okay, well, on that note, we shall wrap it up. And I was remiss at the outset. I did not thank the Kennan Institute for co-sponsoring this event with CEPA. My bad. Thanks to Will and the Kennan Institute for being our co-sponsor on this. I'd also like to thank our awesome panelists. Maria Snegovaya, my colleague at CEPA, is a fellow at CEPA's Russia program. Denise Volkov, my old friend, is a Moscow-based sociologist and deputy director of the Levada Center. And William Pomerantz is deputy director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. I'd also like to remind everybody that you can download and read this excellent report at www.cepa.org. And I'd like to give a big thanks to our virtual audience out there in YouTube land. Please, everybody, stay safe and listen to your health officials. See you all next time. And on that note, we wrap it up.